this over because I found I couldn't always see.
Yes. Could you move the other one
as well?
Thank you.
We're okay now. We've got full vision. Not that it was great excitement.
Maximum input.
Yeah. Good. Okay, I'm doing the talking, but Eric and Alvin have done all the analysis. So leave those to
Eric.
Yes.
And Alvin did my science, helped me with my science.
We saw him in the video actually, so thanks to those two. And Eric also helped with some of the number crunching, so double thanks. Those of you who don't know me, my background is English teaching, classroom English teaching. And I've got a kind of dual purpose here, which is I'm interested in ways of helping science teachers become more aware of what the difficulties are for their students when studying through English, and how to help them. But also I'm interested in English teachers being aware of what's happening in the classroom next to them, and perhaps that making them rethink what they're doing with their own English classes. And those of you who are English teachers and who haven't seen any science on the written page might be rather shocked, I think. I certainly was when I started thinking about this, when I was working in schools where they were trying to teach through English. So today I'll just briefly talk about what these difficulties of language in science are, and the language resources we use to create the meanings that we need, particularly looking at lexical density and briefly at expansion of the nominal group, or noun phrase if you're not using SFL. And then a quick introduction to the main textbooks that are used in junior secondary science. And then sort of where we're up to with the data. I mean, it's very early stages at the moment, and where we would like to go. So, starting with a, I didn't write down when I started. It's okay, great. Excellent. Wellington and Osborne are very key science educators in the UK. And it's interesting how much emphasis they put on the language. I mean, basically, they're pretty much saying that learning science is learning the language of science. And they are talking about students in Britain, most of whom will be speaking English all the time, maybe monolingual English speakers, but still, that shift from your everyday English in the playground to the English you need to express scientific knowledge, even at school level, is a massive leap, and they see it as the major barrier to students learning English. So, if it's a major barrier in the UK, it's a double major barrier here, because not only have you got the leap from the playground language to the scientific language, but you've got the leap from the Chinese to the English. And I think Angel Lin talked about this in Perling a year ago, this kind of double leap that students have to make. So what are these difficulties? Overall, it's an increase in abstraction and compression of information as students go through primary and up into secondary. And this creates a sort of a difficulty in written language, which is necessary. We can't avoid it. And you know, most of us are aware that the meaning and the language cannot be pulled apart. That if you have meaning, then you necessarily have the language. Very generally, the abstraction and the compression is happening because in science, relationship between processes are very, very important. And so to talk about these relationships, you first of all take a process, you turn it into a thing, and then you can relate it to other things, and you can discuss and evaluate it. And it's that process it's those meanings which require the abstraction and the compression. So let's have an example. We're going to look at a text, but before we look at the text, we'll look at the visuals. This is from a secondary 3 book that's very popular. It looks as if it's a museum piece. It is the 2012 edition. They do mention LCD televisions later, that they're keener on this one, I think, because the science fits in with secondary 3 better. Anyway. So you've got the picture that you see, close up, showing that it's made up of different lights, and then how that is part of the television and how those lights are in strips with 3 colours. And then it highlighting the action of the electric guns shooting the beam onto these strips and sort of activating them so that you get different colours lit up and get the picture. Okay, I'm an English teacher, not a science teacher. It's my best effort, I'm afraid. Okay, this is what they get in the book accompanying that text, that figure. And I've just highlighted a bit in the middle which sort of illustrates what I mean by the compression and the abstraction. So the brightness of the light emitted. Okay, that's what we're talking about in this sentence, the brightness of the light emitted. And if you go back, you can see where that comes from. So you've got the electric guns emit the beams towards the screen. Then you've got the strips, and the beam hits the strips, and so they emit the light. And then all of that is kind of packaged down into this nominal group or noun phrase, and this new concept, the brightness. So how is the brightness formed? The brightness of this light that we've already talked about, which is emitted, and all of that's packed down and reduced. And so you've got a compressed, abstract concept there. And similarly with the strength of the electric beam. So that's the kind of language that I'm interested in looking at and seeing how prevalent it is in the books. And well, how do we do that packing, and how is it described? Very common to talk in terms of lexical density. Primarily, people talk about it in terms of ratio of lexical items, so the content words to total number of words, so therefore brightness, light emitted are your content words, but of your non-content or grammatical or function words. Or a more useful way of doing it is content words, lexical items per clause, and then you can compare more easily between texts, and I can say more about that if you'd like me to later. And clauses that are acting as clauses, not that being squashed and put into a nominal group. That text we looked at has a lexical density of 8.7. So 8 points on average, nearly 9 lexical items per clause operating as a clause. Typical spoken English between 1.5 and 2. Typical written between 3 and 6. So 8.7 is high, it's kind of extreme writing. If we've got this continuum, from spoken to writing, we're going right out of the extreme. How is it achieved? Okay, so we pack we get lexical density by packing things into the nominal group, and particularly through embedding, which is very productive. We can, like a Russian doll, we can be inside, inside, inside. So for example, I'm doing 48. Okay, 10 minutes. I'm all right. This is an example from the new example we've got now that's replaced the A-level and the CEE, so one diploma taken at the end of secondary 6. I would admit here to cherry picking. There are lots of questions that are easier to read than this one. However, let's go for the difficult one. I've made it extra difficult because I didn't have time to sort of cut and paste the jolly little pin man on the starting block, so you just have to imagine that bit. Have a little look at that and enjoy it. I've not changed that at all, I promise. I should have copied it so that you believe me. Huge, great sentence. In sort of grammatical terms, in sort of sentence structure terms, extremely simple. X is Y. We've got, you know, the most minimal verb phrase linking the two nominal groups. Everything in black, dirty grey nominal groups. Nominal group is nominal group. That's dense. It's dense. How does it work? I've got brackets there that I shouldn't have. Okay. I think I've cut and pasted the wrong one. Okay, anyway, sorry, let's ignore these ones. But so the basic is the impulse is the change in momentum. And then we're learning more about the impulse. It's the impulse which is exerted by the sprinter's foot on the starting block. So which is exerted by the sprinter's block is embedded into the nominal phrase, the nominal group, the impulse. And then the change in momentum also, which is caused by the total force, expanding the second nominal group. And then you can go further, the change in momentum caused by the total force, and then within that you've got acting on the block. So you've got the real Russian doll things inside things. And we can go further, but I'm not going to. Lexical density 15. Okay. So if our students are going to study in English and do their school leaving exams in English, they've got to be able to deal with this in the exam. So how do we get them there? And obviously, reading isn't the only issue, and, you know, as Gail was talking about, but it's the issue that I'm looking at here. Just reminding you of what's typical. So just breaking down the language resources a little bit, I'll just go through this fairly quickly. That's what I've had, is it? Oh, excellent, okay. So the finite clause can act as the head. So you would have this is the answer, this is my brother, and here you've got this is, and then the because clause. You can have non-finite clauses as the head of the nominal group. I've added some examples from an old chemistry book, just because I found them more quickly. And I think some of these are less represented in the new books. And then the ones that we saw before, the post-modifiers, so the embedding not acting as the clause, but as telling you more about the clause coming after the nominal group, sorry. So the finite clause post-modifying the nominal group. And quite often as definitions. So this one you get a lot. And here similarly post-modifying, but instead of the finite clause with the relative pronoun, you've got different types of non-finite clause. Okay, so different types of language resources that are expanding the nominal group and causing that lexical density and causing that potential difficulty for the students. Other resources as well, which I'm not going to talk about as much, but sort of where we have the clauses, you can also have it happening at phrase level. And then there's also all the possible things happening in front of the head of the nominal group. Okay, so the books that we're looking at, the market is dominated by 3 publishers. And Hong Kong, for those of you who don't know, the publishers have quite a tight hold on the market, certain publishers. The 3 publishers here are Oxford, Longman, and sort of Hong Kong-based, Hong Kong published, Oxford, Hong Kong published, Longman, and then also Aristo, which is a more locally based version. They are incredibly similar, which makes it much easier to find comparable texts to compare. I tried doing this with geography texts in Europe, and it was incredibly difficult to find comparable texts. I mean, I'm going to talk about an acid rain one. When I was trying to do this in Europe, one book had acid rain as a physical explanation, and one had acid rain as an argument about who was culpable. And very, very different genres, and the subject matter cut up in very different ways. We don't get that problem here in terms of text analysis. If you look at this one example, the effects of acid rain, and if you look at the divisions, almost identical. And that happens throughout. I took very initial unit from each book. I'm going to talk about S1, Secondary 1 and Secondary 2 today, and not Secondary 3. We're still sort of processing that. So I took a unit which was called Studying Living Things or Looking at Living Things, depending on the book. And then these texts of varying genres, procedures, reports, and arguments. I've called them sort of 6 texts. In some books, text 1. In some books, for example, text 2 was 1 text. In some books, it was 2 mini texts put together. So they're not as identical as was suggested before. Then that one from Secondary 2. Even with all those similarities, you can still see that Oxford here, it looks as if the texts are much, much longer. But obviously you'd have to look at a lot more than just 6 groups of texts to see if that was a pattern. I did begin to feel that Longman overall might be shorter texts. The word on the street, I mean, schools often choose Aristo because they think there's more reading in it. So we need to look at more to see if that is true. So length is one issue, as well as density. Density, first table is averages, second is range. So S2 is higher density than S1. S1 seems fairly similar in averages, but when you look at the ranges, you can see that there's a wider spread in some books than others. And 9.7, you are getting up quite dense, even just with S2. I mean, what is the perfect progression? We don't know. So what? As I say, this is where we are at the moment, looking at the different lexical density. How is it made up? What kind of language resources do we need to focus on more? So we've got the whole range, particularly maybe non-finite clauses, which I think is interesting from an English teacher's point of view. Not so much maybe as head. And then we'll just look at that 9.7, that the most dense one from the first 2 years of secondary. And again, I've just highlighted a couple of areas. So at the beginning, you've got acid rain as one nominal group, mainland China as another, and then the first highlighted nominal group, you've got both of those ideas coming in together. So here, not clause but phrases embedded. And then it talks about the production of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides and inside cars. And then you've got one that I should have highlighted, the number of motor vehicles in mainland China, so moving it over to cars, and then the amount of nitrogen oxides released from motor vehicles. So then you've got several of the concepts from earlier on picked up and in that the nominal group. So obviously, you know, as we could see in the earlier one with the colour TV, which is from secondary 3, and you can see that it's also happening to some extent here in secondary 2. It also important is information flow and theme and dream, sort of what issues are picked up and then used as the starting point for the next point. So I think you can't separate out these things. And then other issues of cohesion, and there might even be a referencing an article use that you might even disagree with, which causes extra problems. And then you end up with quite an abstract version, emission of a large amount of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere. So building up and up to get, starting out with the small nominal groups, and by the end of the text you've got the long ones. Okay. So, I'm 1 minute over. We can't avoid this density. There seems to be a gradual process, although there's great variety within the books. We can't just look at nominal groups, you have to think about it in the text, sort of the information flow, cohesion. Science teachers need to unpack and repack these things because students need to be able to write them in the exams. But also, English teachers, do we have that kind of density in the text we use in English classes in secondary school? I don't think we do. And I think there's been a gradual, you know, we keep finding students have difficulty with English, so we make the content simpler, and we can do that with English because we can have whatever content we want. So we go for simpler and simpler content to make the language easier. Great, fine, within the English class, apart from the fact that it's become very boring and trivial. However, you've then got this bigger leap from the English to the science. I think as English teachers we need to rethink that. So, more work to be done on the resources used in the nominal groups. And then looking at how they're used in the texts as well. And I really think we need to go back and think about English again as well. Those are some of the books I referred to, and those are some of the references. Thank you.